I'm so excited. I've talked constantly about this game in other Loop reviews as a glowing example of an early access launch, a well-built PvE, PvP survival crafter that is balanced while still making you work for your rewards, and as a blueprint for how co-op multiplayer games should be. V-Rising originally launched 2 years ago in early access and has gone through 3 versions to date, with the official 1.0 release out now. Each iteration of the game had some changes in quality of life things mixed about, but building itself into its 1.0 version took time to craft and plenty of player feedback to make. I could go on and on about the experiences in all 3 versions, early access, Gloomrot, and 1.0. But that's the point of this review, so let's get into it. Does V-Rising still hold up as an industry darling from early access and Gloomrot? Or does the official launch smell of blood? Grab your gothic weapons and a piping hot blood of choice for V-Rising's loot. Playing V-Rising at this point feels really familiar. It helps that the game's been out for 2 years in early access with its launch in 2022. The top-down view and movement system, weapons and combat, crafting and castle maintenance all feels as tight as it did the first day in early access. But there have been some changes over the years that expand on options for players as well as the overall progression of the game. Starting with combat, it has ties to games like Diablo or even MOBAs like League of Legends, with its clicky, fast, skill shot based projectile systems. The abilities are easier to attain with player choice in 1.0, with options instead of flat ability progression from previous iterations. And a handful of abilities have seen a bit of a rework or new abilities taking their place to better suit the player and their needs. What worked well for me is that most of the abilities that I used in previous versions of the game are all still there, so the muscle memory of it all made my life a bit easier. Speaking of easier, the entire progression system of the game feels easier and less grindy until you hit near max level, but that grind in particular feels out of place because of it. The need for materials and re-upping your fancy boss necklaces, a change from previous versions, forces you to stop your progression, which has been pretty seamless to this point, in order to remain viable, and in turn feels like a ploy to up the active user numbers at the top end. Gearing and the rest of the crafting system feels a bit more streamlined, but I miss some players' abilities from early on in the game's life. Mostly with building. The option to plot out your own land based on tiles instead of having cut off zones to build in. I remember specifically during the early access period making a mega castle by using 2 castle hearts to build out a large footprint. There are some spots in the game where this is still sort of possible, but the freedom of it previously was simply more fun. The building itself, though, is simple but effective, allowing customization while also guiding the player to have specific areas for specific objects, and allowing multiple floors to build a true castle instead of just the one floor sprawl from the original early access product. One thing that the game does beyond a doubt, though, is allow for playstyle optimization and customization. I was never a big fan of sticking to one class of magic or having flat armor choices in a straight line. With some of the recent updates and 1.0 as a whole, there are many more opportunities for choice in how you play in combat, armor, weapons, spells, gems. The options are endless, and all of them feel viable and balanced in their own right, which some major companies in other genres can't do to save their lives in multiplayer games. The game even allows full color customization of your clothes for free in the UI. A nice change from looking the exact same across the board the first time my group and I played through. V-Rising makes a lot of opportunity for its players in its world. There are 9 zones, sort of, for the player to traverse and conquer, as well as many subzones to farm with both your minions and yourself. I say there are sort of 9 zones because there are sort of. Going through the list, it's hard to call some areas a zone, even if the game gives you the distinction when entering them. The list of these zones is as follows. Fairbane Woods, the entry-level zone for most players, with many encampments, mines, and installations about to start the player off in all of their vampiric glory. Nothing here is too difficult or high level, besides the occasional wandering boss, and the progression through this area is pretty self-explanatory. Dunley Farmlands is next, with its pastures and farms, and the worst part, garlic, hanging about that gives a pretty nasty debuff if you stand around and let it stack for too long. The zone is easily the center point, and is where most would build their true long-term castle, unless you play with my friends, in which case we need at least 2 or 3 sprinkled around the entire map. The next few zones are where things get a bit weird for my whole numbering system. Hallowed Mountains has nothing really there. Sure, it has a couple bosses and some space for castles in its snow-covered mountains, but really that's it. There's no reason to keep going there after the bosses are beaten. Similarly, we end up in Mortium, and it's kind of its own special thing as well, with time zone events that are pretty obviously meant to be a PvP butcher shop of players if that's what you're into, but also has some requirements for PvE players as well for crafting later stage items and upgrading weapons. The thing about Mortium is that I feel like it should be bigger and 2 full zones. One for the lower levels when you first get there, around level 50 if memory serves, and one of the higher levels for the endgame, level 80 plus. What's funny about that idea is that's exactly how Gloomrot was set up. Gloomrot is 2 zones, Gloomrot North and Gloomrot South. South is lower levels and gets you your first taste of the Gloomrot enemies and materials. North does all of that and adds in the fun of lightning strikes. It's a party. The last zones that we deal with are the Cursed Forest and Silverlight Hills. Cursed Forest is in the north of the map and adds in some additional horror vibes, specifically dealing with ghosts and undead animals and spiders. Apparently they're Dracula's favorite monstrosity that's in every fucking game in this genre. Damn dirty bugs are in every game and cannot be stopped. Silverlight Hills is in the main human hub full of luxury resources, the best military, and the high priest of the Holy Order here to take control and protect humanity from vampires. Last of all is Mortium Round 2, and the lead up to Dracula, with his minions getting ready to rebuild and push back into the world. All of the zones around the map are full of life and tasty snacks for players to find and explore, and each one really gives a twist to what is happening in this world. Somehow Stunlock Studios took a really good thing and made it even better. There's a lot of changes that happened between the early access phase and 1.0 phase of V Rising. There's even a lot of changes since Gloomrot around a year ago. First and foremost, the overall game on a normal server feels easier in many aspects. I guess I should back up a bit. There are different difficulties now added in the server creation options. The changes are more than just bosses have more health also. Whole new phases and abilities for some fights. The bosses on normal, especially up through Act 3, feel easier than I remember them. It could be that for the most part, normal servers are a lesser difficulty overall than early access and Gloomrot were back when they were one size fits all. Could be that since I've played through the 3 different variations of this game that I just know what to expect on many bosses. The ones I don't know though are a trip. That's another new change, is there are a few bosses laid out around the map at different levels that are brand new. Overall, these bosses are good. They do show the comfort of the devs and the engine after many years though, and how much more there is to these bosses compared to OG early access bosses. Choosing your talents and playstyle is now left more to the player choice than previous iterations. It used to be that each boss had a specific power that you would gain after beating them. Now it's more of a talent point system with tiers that allow you to unlock things a bit easier when leveling up to get the new flow for your style. The whole new zone and what that entails is also a big change from the previous versions. Mortium, Dracula's Fall, the timed events, and a few bosses are all new in these areas, and some have even been moved around to these areas where they fit better in the overall style of each zone. The one thing that they took away that I miss was the tiniest little detail known as compulsively count. It was a dumb thing. Vampires compulsively count objects. The count in Sesame Street is a perfect example of this trope. And V Rising had that in early access as your sorting items into boxes button, and now it's just called sort when it even has text, and not an icon. A little thing, but those details are what really helped make this game for me. The story of V Rising is pretty short and sweet, but there are a lot of little details hidden around, especially on bosses, if you're paying attention. Dracula is dead. Used here in air quotes. In his absence, humanity has started to spread back around the area, pushing back the darkness and building up its holy order. Vampires have since reawakened and look to reclaim the land formerly owned by Dracula, each vying for their own slice of the pie. Your goal is to take back the lands lost and put vampires back on top of the food chain. Until you find out that old Dracula is still kicking somewhere, and he needs to go down also for you to claim your rightful place as top bat. That's the vast majority of it, but there are many other little pieces at play, especially with the bosses as I mentioned before, who they are, and how each of them ties into the overall events, as well as where their loyalties lie. It's time for the tangent topic, and this time around, I want to talk about one of the key ways that games like V Rising are even played. One of my biggest issues with Nightingale during its derailed review was its lack of private or dedicated servers. I didn't really explain how that works or what it even means. To start, I have a spare gaming PC that I use as a media server, and when the time calls, as a game server for my friends and I to play games together on. A private or dedicated server is one that is set up and run either by a third party or the players themselves, where they and their friends can play on their own without the fear or headaches that can be caused by other parties butting in, namely other players or the devs for the most part. No option for someone to take your game away when you own and operate the server it's running on. There are a lot of customization options that you can use on your own private server as well. In V-Rising in particular, there are quality of life or difficulty settings you can impose on yourself, as well as the rest of the players on your server. You can use the new difficulty settings to start a brutal server, as well as giving yourself god powers to make creating or building a breeze, if that's what you fancy in these kinds of games. Not everyone has a second top tier gaming PC just laying around like I do. If that's you and you want to run your own server, you have a couple of options as well to control your own gaming experience. First off, you can just run it on your gaming PC, assuming your specs are high enough. Solid CPU and RAM combo is enough to do the trick in most cases. The other option is to buy a space on a server that is made for this type of thing. Before I go any farther, I'm not about to sponsor something or be sponsored, and I'm not sponsored by any of the companies that do this kind of thing, but I have used them before, back before I had the spare sitting around, or if it was just too complicated to do at home. These services allow players to rent a server to run a game on and give them the tools and login to handle it on their own. Great options for a lot of players, especially since the cost isn't all that much, about as much as a Netflix subscription in most cases. Now it's time for everybody's favorite or least favorite topic of all of my reviews, the issues. Honestly, I don't have many. I enjoyed this game in early access. I enjoyed it in Gloomrot, and I really enjoy it now. There has always been enough new to bring me back and make me want to play again from the start. It is a little reliant on muscle memory lately, but it's still overall a fun experience handling things differently, running different setups, etc. My issues start with the overall progression of the game. It feels more blurry than it used to, especially at higher levels. Lots of bleed over areas and running into enemies that can easily one-shot you if you're too low of a level. Tristan the Vampire Hunter roams around the area where we made our first base, in the first zone of the game, and he's tough even at level. There's roaming packs in Mortium that way out-level players when they are expected to walk in there for their first time. This is a get good or learn the game situation, I'm well aware, but it feels a bit needless. On top of random one-shots, the progression hits harder walls when there are any walls at all. It was common for my group and I to run straight through an active bosses and be absolutely humbled by a random boss or mob that we could be plenty geared for. One key thing we found is that 3 players felt way easier in many cases than 2 players or even solo. Until you get to the last fight, but you can see how that worked in my streams or my kill video if you're really looking to spoil yourself. All in, I'm so happy V-Rising is visually launched. The game is very well polished and has some minor issues to fix to be damn near perfect for me as far as these kinds of games go. I will admit that PvP is not something I am at all interested in outside of FPS games, so that was not my aim with this game. Maybe there are some game-breaking things out there from those types of players, but as a PvE experience, V-Rising has risen far above a lot of the competition, and that's just because it actually launched. Will we see the same from Valheim when it hits 1.0 or even Satisfactory? We'll have to wait for their day in the sun to find out, but for now, it's strictly time for the creatures of the night.